their probes. And so some questions to highlight for you to ask the intermediary is, are beneficiary edits counted in the charge denial rate? So oftentimes when you're on a probe, that if they deny a claim, that beneficiary will get pulled automatically the next month. And again, not every intermediary works that way, but if they pull that for the next month, if that person gets denied again, is that going to count in your charge denial rate for your probe? And so that's an important question, because suddenly things can sort of balloon very quickly if they always include beneficiary edits in your charge denial rate. And then, is the charge denial rate adjusted based on claims won on appeal? For example, Palmetto will adjust your charge denial rate if on reconsideration or redetermination you win a case on appeal. NGS currently doesn't do that. And so that can be important as you're trying to calculate your own charge denial rate, and also in the event you want to do some advocacy. I mean, we've used those points before, saying, well, you know, I know you usually don't adjust the charge denial rate for things we want on appeal, but, you know, we're very close to the 15% charge denial rate to get off this probe, and we've won these cases. And so, again, it's very helpful to understand how they're going to run the probe, but also that you're keeping track of that data, so you know how many things you've won. And then how will the pull work? For instance, NGS typically they pull every fifth claim. Some other intermediaries will pull a random sample, a percentage sample, so 15% of your claims that meet the probe criteria. So it can really vary, and understanding that on the front end. Now, some intermediaries will explain to some level of detail how the probe works, but usually it's not enough that you would really understand this type of information. And so those are just a sampling of some questions, but you should not feel afraid of looking stupid or asking questions that, oh, I'm not going to know the answer, I'm going to look foolish by asking this question. And I think the worst thing you can do is to I guess, not ask a question because you're worried about looking naive or foolish. If anything, by calling and being very proactive, it shows that you're taking this seriously and that you want to make sure you understand it. And so I think you can make a very good impression by being very on top of it. If anything, by not asking questions, you put yourself sometimes in a greater hole with the intermediary. Again, in a situation we dealt with, where someone didn't understand the process, you know, the intermediary really interpreted their actions as they were blowing off the situation and not taking it seriously, when really the provider wasn't feeling that way at all. They just really, truly didn't understand, and they didn't know what questions to ask. And so there was a clear disconnect. And so being proactive and calling is very important. Moving on to slide 6 is, even if your ADR doesn't result in targeted medical review, it can have some pretty serious ramifications, and that's why getting organized and putting your best foot forward is really important. You can very quickly have cash flow problems, and one of the things that we're going to talk about in a second is you might be able to reduce some of that cash flow problems by asking for some adjustment to the intermediary. But you can have cash flow problems because those claims, once they're ADR'd, they will be held up and not paid until they complete medical review on that. And even if you continue to bill, which you should continue to bill those claims will not be processed until that first claim is reviewed by medical review because of subsequent billing. So you need to understand that cash flow issues can arise pretty quickly. And then just the scarce resource of time and energy and resources is, you know, you don't have people devoted to copying medical records and writing cover letters. And so being organized and putting these tasks over a period of time can help limit that, but it's still going to be a stretch on your resources. And then, while not likely, sometimes fraud investigations can come out of medical review or an ADR. Now, typically that's not going to happen unless you've been on targeted medical review for some time, where the requirements that intermediaries have to follow is sometimes they need to refer that over to the program safeguard contractor, or now ZPICs, for additional review from a fraud perspective. And so that's not something that you necessarily have to worry about in the very beginning, but can be some ramifications if you continue to be on targeted medical review for a while. Moving on to slide 7, again, as I said earlier, you don't want to try to outsmart the intermediary. You really want to cooperate with them. So some people will say, oh, I know they're going to deny this claim, and so therefore I'm going to stop billing for this patient. And that actually can be very troublesome. Anyway, I think you really need to not adjust how you're billing for things on the front end just because you're in an ADR, because if there are billing irregularities, that's going to get picked up. And they're actually going to think that you're trying to do something that you're not trying to do, and you're not trying to game the system, but that's how it could be interpreted. You also want to consider asking for an educational call. That's something that you can do whenever you'd like to do. It shows that you're taking the process seriously, and that you're concerned, and that you want to get input from them about how they think you should be doing. And then finally, if the probe is causing a burden on you, let's say you're a small program with 40 patients and they say they're going to pull 40 claims, that is going to be a large burden on you. So you can call them and ask if they would do a smaller sample, or even if you're a larger program, if all of the samples are going to be pulled in an individual month, that's a lot of work to process in an individual month. You might be able to ask them to divide that up under a couple months. Moving on to slide 7 is this grid, and I don't need to talk about it, but I think it's a really helpful depiction of how the appeal process works. So it's a stair stepper, and you keep going up to different levels of appeal. Now, we're not going to spend much time talking about appeals council or federal court. We're going to focus on the first 3 levels, but just thought that depiction was helpful. Moving on to the next slide is you need to objectively evaluate whether or not to pursue appeal. You will hear from colleagues that say, well, of course you want to appeal everything. I had great success at ALJ. And that may be true, but you need to evaluate your particular case and those individual strengths and weaknesses of your documentation. So do you really have the documentation to support that claim? Are there other problems in the record that could create issues for you, or raise issues with the credibility of the documentation? Do you have inconsistencies? Are there things that look like the record was doctored in any way? Are there technical issues looming? You need to look at it objectively. And maybe you still go forward and be prepared to explain those, but there's things that you want to identify on the front end. And then also consider looking at the LCD guidelines. Those are not law, but we know that the intermediaries do pay a lot of attention to them, and understanding your case and whether or not it's meeting elements of the LCD is important. I would say our practical experience has been that ALJs don't give as much deference to the LCDs as the intermediaries do, which they're required to apply those, but you need to understand, are you squarely fitting within the LCD or not? And then just because the intermediary said a claim it should be denied doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case. So you have to do your own evaluation of the strength of the case. And then on the next slide, even though we have worked with clients through some very difficult processes, I think that most clients will